Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. Mount Hood had always seemed welcoming to Marcus and me. We had visited before on short day trips, quick drives from Eugene when we needed a change of scenery from our cramped apartment and demanding jobs. But we had never ventured into its deeper reaches, the isolated corners away from tourists and marked trails. When we found a posting online advertising a rustic, secluded cabin, off-grid, miles from the nearest neighbor, it sounded like the ideal escape from our stressful lives. The advertisement was sparse on details, the price surprisingly affordable, and we didn't ask too many questions. The owner, whoever he was, assured us via email that we would find everything we needed inside. His final message warned that cell signals died out past the rhododendron groves, which sounded like paradise at the time. No buzzing phones, no endless notifications, no constant demands from work. Just the quiet solitude we had been craving for months. We drove past government camp early on a gray October morning, the air crisp with the promise of winter. The main highway gave way to smaller roads, then to a dirt path marked only by a faded wooden sign that simply read, "Private Road." The overgrown track wound deeper into the forest, branches scraping against our windows with increasing frequency. The GPS signal had died 20 minutes earlier, leaving us to follow the rough directions scrawled on a piece of paper. After nearly an hour of bumping along the deteriorating road, the path became too narrow for our sedan. Marcus parked beside a stand of ancient Douglas firs, their massive trunks disappearing into the misty canopy above. From there, we shouldered our bags and hiked the final 50 yards on foot, following a barely visible trail marked by occasional strips of faded orange flagging tape. When we first saw the cabin through the trees, my stomach tightened with unease. It was smaller and rougher than the online photos had suggested. Heavy pine logs formed the walls, their surfaces darkened with age and moisture. Thick moss crept up from the damp earth, coating the foundation in a carpet of sickly green. A rusted manual water pump stood sentinel in the front yard, surrounded by weeds that reached nearly to my waist. The windows were filmed with years of accumulated grime, making it impossible to see inside. Marcus flashed me what I knew he intended as a reassuring grin, though I caught the uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He squeezed my shoulder gently and stepped up onto the sagging porch, keys jingling in his hand. The wooden boards groaned ominously under his weight, and I noticed several planks had warped enough to create gaps where small animals might easily slip through. The heavy door opened with a prolonged shriek of protest from rusted hinges. The air inside hit us immediately, earthy and musty, tinged with something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unpleasant that made my nose wrinkle in distaste. The interior was darker than expected, even with the door wide open. Heavy wooden furniture dominated the small space, covered in thick blankets that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. An old wood-burning stove squatted in one corner, its iron surface spotted with rust. Primitive wooden shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of dented pots, cracked dishes, and mason jars filled with unidentifiable contents. The floorboards creaked with every step, and I noticed several places where gaps between the planks revealed only darkness beneath. On a battered wooden table near the window lay a leather-bound guest book, its cover warped from humidity and speckled with dark mold spots. I picked it up carefully, the leather feeling damp and unpleasant against my fingers. The pages stuck together as I flipped through them. Most entries faded beyond recognition. The handwriting that remained legible spoke of peaceful getaways and refreshing escapes from city life. The most recent entry was dated July 15, 1991. "Enjoy your stay," it read in careful cursive. "This place has a way of getting under your skin. Nothing since over 30 years of silence." The absence of any recent visitors struck me as odd, especially given the online listing's promise of regular bookings. "Charming," Marcus laughed, though the sound came out forced and nervous. Let's get some fresh air. We spent that first evening on the porch, Marcus coaxing a fire to life in a stone ring just outside the cabin door. The familiar scent of burning pine began to drift around us as darkness crept through the forest. It felt peaceful as we settled into folding chairs we had brought from home, sharing a bottle of wine and listening to the symphony of night sounds. The occasional distant owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the snap of a twig somewhere deep in the woods. As the sun disappeared behind the towering peaks, the forest transformed. What had seemed merely quiet during the day now felt oppressively silent. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the star-filled sky, but its warmth seemed insufficient against the encroaching cold. I don't remember which of us noticed first. It might have been Marcus suddenly sitting straighter in his chair, or the way he slowly lowered his wine glass, eyes fixed on something beyond the edge of our clearing. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable, the relaxed slouch replaced by rigid alertness. "What is it?" I asked, following his gaze into the shadowed tree line. "Someone's out there," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I squinted into the dimming light, searching the wall of trees that surrounded our small clearing. At first I saw nothing but the usual forest shapes, thick trunks and tangled undergrowth, all rendered in shades of gray and black by the failing light. Then my eyes found it and my breath caught in my throat. Just beyond the edge of the tree line, perhaps 60 yards away, stood a figure, too far to make out clearly but undeniably human in shape. It stood perfectly motionless, arms at its sides, facing directly toward us. There was something profoundly wrong about its stillness. No shift in weight, no movement of any kind, as if it were carved from stone. "Maybe it's another hiker," I whispered, though something deep in my gut rejected that explanation immediately. The figure's posture was wrong for a casual observer. There was an intentional quality to its positioning, a deliberate patience that made my skin crawl. We waved cautiously, Marcus raising his arm in what he probably intended as a friendly greeting. There was no response, no wave in return, no acknowledgement of any kind, just that terrible, unnatural stillness. Marcus grabbed his flashlight from the table beside his chair and switched it on, aiming the bright beam toward the trees. I held my breath as the light cut through the darkness, illuminating bark and leaves and empty air. The figure had vanished completely, as if it had never been there at all. We exchanged uneasy glances, neither of us speaking for several long minutes. The comfortable isolation we had sought suddenly felt threatening and exposed. Marcus stoked the fire higher, adding more wood than necessary, as if the larger flames could somehow protect us from whatever lurked in the darkness beyond their reach. The night sounds that had seemed so peaceful earlier now carried a different quality. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. Every distant crack of a branch sounded deliberate and calculated. I found myself straining my ears, trying to detect the sound of footsteps or breathing beneath the natural symphony of the forest. We retreated inside earlier than planned, securing the flimsy door latch and checking the primitive window locks. The cabin felt even smaller with the darkness pressing against the glass, and every creak of settling wood made us both jump. Marcus dragged a heavy wooden chair over to the door, wedging it under the handle in a makeshift barricade. Rest did not come easily that night. I lay on the narrow bed beside Marcus, listening to his breathing and the countless small sounds that filled the darkness. Every few minutes I would catch myself holding my breath, straining to hear something that might not belong to the natural nighttime chorus. The image of that motionless figure burned in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. Morning brought weak sunlight filtering through the dirty windows, but little comfort. Marcus was already up when I opened my eyes, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in his hands. His shoulders were tense, and I could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. "Sleep well?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head. "Kept thinking I heard things. Probably just my imagination." We tried to laugh off our unease from the night before over breakfast, but the attempt felt forced. Marcus suggested we walk down toward the spot where we had seen the figure. expecting to find footprints or some other evidence that someone had been standing there. I accompanied him reluctantly, not particularly eager to venture away from the relative safety of the cabin. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Birdsongs filled the trees above us and squirrels chattered in the branches. In the daylight, our fear from the previous evening seemed almost silly. The forest looked innocent and welcoming, nothing like the threatening presence it had become after dark. Marcus led the way to the approximate location where we had seen the figure. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for any sign of disturbance. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves and pine needles, soft and springy underfoot. If someone had been standing there, they should have left some trace. "Nothing," he said finally, crouching down to examine the earth more closely. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing at all. I knelt beside him, running my fingers through the thick layer of organic debris. The ground beneath was soft and damp, the kind of surface that should easily show the impression of a person's weight. Yet there was no evidence that anyone had ever stood there. "Maybe we were further away than we thought," I suggested, though even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't true. The distance had been clear, the positioning unmistakable. We spent the morning exploring the immediate area around the cabin, following what appeared to be old game trails through the forest. The exercise felt good, and the normalcy of hiking helped ease some of the tension from the previous night. We discovered the ruins of what might once have been a small outbuilding, now reduced to a few scattered foundation stones and rotting timbers. On our return trip, Marcus stopped abruptly and pointed to something nailed into the trunk of a massive fir tree. A length of rusted wire had been crudely attached with bent nails, forming what looked like it might once have been part of a fence line. The metal was corroded and ancient, clearly decades old. "Boundary marker, maybe?" Marcus suggested, though his voice carried doubt. I followed the direction the wire seemed to indicate, but it led nowhere meaningful. Just disappeared into the dense undergrowth after a few yards. There were no other markers visible, no signs of an actual fence. Just this single, inexplicable strand of rusted metal nailed to a tree for no apparent reason. We continued our exploration, but the discovery had unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. There was something wrong about finding that random piece of wire, something that felt like a warning or a marker of territory. I found myself glancing back at it repeatedly as we walked away, as if expecting it to have changed or moved when I wasn't looking. Back at the cabin, we spent the afternoon reading and playing cards, trying to maintain the illusion of a normal vacation. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, anxiety began building in my chest. The approaching darkness felt like a physical presence, something malevolent creeping closer with each passing hour. Marcus noticed my growing tension and tried to reassure me. "Probably just a curious local," he said. "Someone who doesn't see many visitors up here." But even he didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. As twilight approached, we both found ourselves glancing frequently toward the windows, watching for any sign of movement in the gathering shadows. We built the fire earlier that second evening, hoping its presence would somehow ward off whatever we had encountered the night before. The flames danced cheerfully in the stone ring, casting flickering light across the small clearing and pushing back the advancing darkness. For a brief time, I allowed myself to believe that our fear had been groundless, a product of overactive imaginations and too much wine. That illusion lasted until the sun disappeared completely behind the mountain peaks. As full darkness settled over the forest, the temperature plummeted. Our breath began forming small clouds in the frigid air, and I pulled a heavy blanket around my shoulders. The fire provided warmth, but only within a small radius. Beyond its reach, the night felt hostile and alive with unseen threats. Marcus was feeding another log to the flames when he suddenly froze, his hand halfway to the woodpile. I followed his gaze and felt my heart skip several beats. The figure was back, but this time it was closer. Much closer. Where the previous night it had stood at the distant edge of the trees, tonight it had advanced to perhaps 40 yards away. Still motionless, still perfectly upright, but near enough now that I could make out more details. The figure appeared to be wearing dark clothing, what looked like a uniform of some kind. though the shadows made it impossible to be certain. "Get the binoculars," Marcus whispered, never taking his eyes off the shape. I fumbled for his binoculars with trembling hands, my movements clumsy with fear. When I finally managed to focus them on the figure, what I saw made my stomach lurch with terror. It was definitely a person, but there was something fundamentally wrong about the way it stood. The posture was too rigid, too perfectly still. No living person could maintain such absolute motionlessness for so long. The figure appeared to be wearing what looked like an old military or park ranger uniform, dark and shapeless with age. I couldn't make out facial features in the darkness, but the head was turned directly toward us with an attention so focused it felt like a physical weight. "What do we do?" I whispered, lowering the binoculars with shaking hands. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He stared at the figure with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and fascination that frightened me almost as much as our mysterious observer. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "But I don't think it means to hurt us. If it did, it would have done something by now." His words provided little comfort. The presence felt malevolent, charged with an intention I couldn't understand but didn't trust. We sat in tense silence for what felt like hours, occasionally glancing toward the figure, which never moved or showed any sign of awareness beyond its unwavering attention. When we finally decided to retreat inside, the figure remained in position. Through the grimy cabin windows, I could just make out its dark silhouette against the slightly lighter background of the forest. It stayed there all night, an unmoving shadow that transformed our temporary sanctuary into a prison. Marcus attempted to rationalize what we were seeing. "Maybe it's someone with mental health issues," he suggested. "Someone who lives up here alone and has lost touch with normal social behavior." But even he didn't sound convinced. There was something about the figure's presence that defied rational explanation. The perfect stillness, the unwavering attention, the complete lack of human gestures or movement. It all combined to create an impression of something that was human in shape, but entirely alien in nature. We didn't sleep at all that night. We took turns watching through the window, though the figure never moved from its position. As dawn approached and the first pale light began filtering through the trees, I expected to see it disappear again. Instead, it simply faded gradually as the growing light rendered it invisible against the forest backdrop. Only when full daylight had arrived did we dare to venture outside. Marcus walked directly to the spot where the figure had stood, examining the ground with forensic intensity. Once again, there was no trace of its presence, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence that anyone had spent the night standing motionless in our clearing. By our third morning, the pretense of enjoying a peaceful vacation had completely evaporated. We were both exhausted from consecutive sleepless nights, and the strain was beginning to show in our relationship. Marcus had become withdrawn and obsessive, spending long periods staring out the windows and jumping at every sound. I found myself snapping at him over trivial matters, my nerves frayed beyond their limits. The decision to leave came suddenly and without discussion. As weak sunlight filtered through the dirty windows, I began packing our belongings with desperate efficiency. Whatever was happening here, we needed to get away from it before our sanity suffered any further damage. Marcus carried our bags out to the car while I did a final sweep of the cabin, making sure we weren't leaving anything behind. The urgency I felt was almost overwhelming, a primitive flight response that demanded immediate escape from what felt like mortal danger. I stepped onto the porch and immediately knew something was wrong. Marcus was hunched over the open hood of our sedan, his hands moving frantically among the mechanical components. The look on his face when he saw me approaching made my stomach drop. "The battery's dead," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Dead? How is that possible? It was fine when we got here." He shook his head grimly, pointing to the battery terminals. "It wasn't an accident. Look, the cables have been disconnected. Someone sabotaged it deliberately." I stared at the evidence with growing horror. The battery cables lay loose beside the terminals, clearly disconnected by human hands. This wasn't mechanical failure or bad luck. Someone had deliberately disabled our vehicle, stranding us in this isolated location. Who would do this? I asked, though I suspected we both knew the answer. Marcus tried reconnecting the battery, but too much power had drained away during the night. The engine wouldn't even turn over. We were trapped miles from civilization, without cell service or any means of communication with the outside world. "We'll have to hike out," Marcus said, attempting to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "If we follow the road back to the main highway, eventually someone will pick us up." The prospect of walking through miles of empty forest filled me with dread, but staying at the cabin felt even worse. Within minutes, we were moving down the narrow dirt road, our footsteps crunching on gravel in the morning stillness. The weight of our backpacks felt reassuring somehow, a tangible connection to the normal world we were trying to reach. After walking for perhaps a mile, Marcus stopped abruptly and pointed to something on the trail ahead. A small pile of pine needles had been arranged in a perfect cone beside the road. They were fresh, recently gathered, and clearly placed there deliberately. "What do you think it means?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I don't know, but I don't like it." We continued walking and discovered more piles at regular intervals, each one precisely positioned and obviously intentional. Someone had marked this trail recently, creating a pattern we couldn't understand, but that filled us both with increasing unease. 20 minutes later, we encountered something that stopped us completely. Nailed to a massive Douglas fir beside the road was an old wooden sign, weathered and faded but still legible. In block letters it read, "Authorized personnel only, U.S. Forest Service Site 17A. "Site 17A? I said. "Have you ever heard of anything like that?" Marcus shook his head. "It's not on any map I've ever seen. And why would they need a special designation for this area?" We stood there for several minutes. Uncertainty paralyzed us. The sign clearly indicated we were trespassing on some kind of restricted government property, but we had no choice except to continue. Returning to the cabin was not an option. As we debated our next move, I became aware of a sound behind us, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps on gravel, matching our pace and rhythm. When we stopped, the sound stopped. When we moved, it resumed. "Someone's following us," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. Marcus nodded grimly. "I've been hearing it for the last 10 minutes. The realization that we were being stalked through the forest sent panic shooting through my nervous system. We increased our pace, no longer concerned with stealth or caution. The footsteps behind us matched our acceleration, maintaining the same distance but never quite coming into view. Fear drove us into a stumbling run, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over hidden obstacles in our desperation to reach safety. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but terror provided endless fuel for our flight through the wilderness. We ran until exhaustion forced us to stop, collapsing against the trunk of a massive cedar to catch our breath. My heart hammered against my ribs and sweat stung my eyes despite the cold air. Marcus gasped beside me, scanning the forest behind us for any sign of pursuit. The woods around us seemed different from the area near the cabin. The trees were older here, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes that cast bizarre shadows in the filtered sunlight. The undergrowth was thicker too, creating countless hiding places where an observer could remain concealed. "I don't hear the footsteps anymore," Marcus whispered. I strained my ears but detected only the normal sounds of the forest, wind in the branches, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of small animals in the brush. Our pursuer had either given up or was waiting silently somewhere nearby. We continued more cautiously, staying alert for any signs of human presence. The dirt road had dwindled to little more than a deer path, winding between the ancient trees in a route that seemed to follow no logical pattern. I began to suspect we had gotten turned around somewhere, taken a wrong path in our panicked flight. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked. Marcus studied the faint trail ahead of us, uncertainty clear in his expression. "I thought so, but nothing looks familiar anymore." The admission filled me with fresh dread. We were lost in trackless wilderness, being stalked by someone with unknown intentions, and our supplies wouldn't last more than a day or two. The situation was rapidly deteriorating from bad to desperate. As we pushed deeper into the forest, we began encountering strange artifacts scattered among the trees. A rusted metal sign warning of hazardous materials lay half-buried beneath fallen leaves. Further along, we discovered what appeared to be concrete foundation blocks, partially overgrown but clearly artificial. "What do you think this used to be?" I asked, examining the remnants. "Some kind of facility," Marcus replied, his voice troubled. "But why way out here and why abandoned?" The mystery deepened when we found additional signs of human activity. Lengths of rusted pipe protruding from the earth, fragments of chain-link fencing tangled in the undergrowth, and concrete pads that might once have supported buildings or equipment. All of it was old and deteriorated, suggesting whatever had been here was abandoned decades ago. Most disturbing of all were the signs warning of contamination and radiation hazards. Their messages faded but still readable. Whatever had operated in this remote location clearly involved dangerous materials that might still pose a threat. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tight with new fear. But as we attempted to retrace our steps, it became clear that we were completely lost. The faint trail we had been following seemed to branch in multiple directions, all leading deeper into the forest. Worse, I was beginning to hear the footsteps again, distant but persistent, always staying just beyond the range of sight. Our stalker had found us again, and this time there was nowhere to run. The afternoon wore on as we stumbled through increasingly difficult terrain, our water running low and our energy depleted by fear and exertion. The strange ruins appeared more frequently now, creating an impression of a vast abandoned complex hidden beneath decades of forest growth. As evening approached, we found ourselves in a small clearing dominated by what appeared to be the remains of a concrete bunker. Its walls were cracked and stained, with vegetation growing through gaps in the structure. A heavy metal door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing only darkness within. "We can't keep wandering in the dark," Marcus said. "Maybe we should shelter here for the night." The prospect of entering that ruined bunker filled me with revulsion, but our alternatives were limited. We had no idea where we were or how to find our way back to civilization. Worse, our pursuer was still out there somewhere, patient and tireless in its attention. As darkness fell, we had no choice but to seek refuge in the abandoned structure, wondering what we might find in its shadowed interior and whether morning would bring rescue or something far worse. The interior of the bunker reeked of decay and something chemical that burned my nostrils. Marcus used his phone's flashlight to illuminate the space, revealing concrete walls stained with moisture and covered in patches of fungus. The floor was littered with debris, fragments of electronic equipment, scattered papers, and pieces of furniture that had been reduced to splinters by time and neglect. In one corner, we discovered a metal filing cabinet that had fallen onto its side, its drawers hanging open and empty. But wedged behind it, Marcus found a manila folder that had somehow survived the years of abandonment. The papers inside were water-damaged and partially illegible, but enough remained to paint a disturbing picture. "Forest Service Internal Investigation," Marcus read aloud. "Subject, Ranger Mitchell Jennings, Station 17A. Incident date, July 23, 1991. My breath caught. The date matched the final entry in the cabin's guest book. Marcus continued reading from the fragmented documents. Subject displayed increasingly erratic behavior following assignment to remote monitoring station. Reports of confrontations with unauthorized campers. Supervisor noted paranoid ideation and potential substance abuse. The papers told a story of a forest ranger assigned to patrol this isolated area who had gradually lost his sanity. The final report described a violent incident in which Jennings had shot 2 people he claimed were trespassing on government property, then turned the weapon on himself. "The cabin," I whispered. "He was stationed at that cabin." Marcus nodded grimly. "And those people he killed, they must have been staying there illegally, just like us." We read through the remaining documents by the dim light of the phone, piecing together a narrative of tragedy and madness. Jennings had been responsible for guarding whatever secret facility had operated here. But the isolation and stress had warped his mind until he saw enemies everywhere. The final document was a recommendation that Station 17A be permanently closed and all associated structures sealed. But apparently, someone had continued to rent out the cabin to unsuspecting vacationers, never mentioning its dark history. "So what we've been seeing," I began. Is impossible, Marcus finished. Jennings has been dead for over 30 years. But even as he spoke the words, we both knew that what we had experienced was real. The figure watching from the forest, the sabotaged car, the patient stalking through the wilderness, all of it had happened, regardless of whether it could be rationally explained. A sound from outside the bunker made us both freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate, circling the structure where we had taken refuge. Marcus switched off the phone's light, plunging us into complete darkness. The footsteps continued their circuit, never varying in pace or rhythm. Around and around they went, as if our hiding place was being methodically examined for weaknesses. I pressed myself against the concrete wall, trying to control my breathing and hoping the darkness would conceal us. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The footsteps would sometimes pause for long periods, only to resume without warning. Once I heard what sounded like breathing right outside the broken door. But when Marcus carefully checked with his light, nothing was there. Dawn seemed impossibly distant when we finally heard the sound we had been hoping for, the distant rumble of a vehicle engine. Marcus crept to the door and peered out into the gray pre-dawn light. "Truck," he whispered. "Official looking. Forest Service, I think." We emerged from our hiding place cautiously, calling out as loudly as we dared. The vehicle stopped and a uniformed ranger stepped out, regarding us with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "You folks lost?" he asked. Ranger Hank Redding was a man in his 60s with weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much of what the wilderness could do to people. He listened to our story with growing alarm, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never expressing outright disbelief. When we finished our account, he was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the forest where we claimed to have been stalked. "That cabin's been officially condemned since 1992, he said finally. "Nobody's supposed to be renting it out to anybody." "But we have emails," Marcus protested. "Confirmation numbers, payment receipts," Redding nodded. "I believe you, but whoever took your money isn't affiliated with the Forest Service. That property is supposed to be permanently sealed." He drove us to the regional headquarters where we spent hours giving detailed statements to investigators. They promised to look into both the illegal rental operation and our claims about being stalked, but their skeptical expressions made it clear they weren't expecting to find anything conclusive. "Happens more often than you'd think," one investigator explained. "Urban explorers, ghost hunters, thrill seekers. They break into abandoned properties and sometimes have encounters they can't explain. Isolation and fear can play tricks on the mind. But I knew what we had experienced wasn't psychological. The sabotaged car, the systematic stalking, the deliberate intimidation, all of it had been real and purposeful, regardless of who or what was responsible." The drive back to Eugene passed in relative silence. Marcus stared out the window at the passing landscape, lost in thoughts he didn't share. I found myself constantly checking the side mirrors, half expecting to see a familiar figure standing by the roadside, watching our departure. Back in our apartment, surrounded by the familiar comforts of civilization, the entire experience began to feel like a bizarre nightmare. But the evidence was real enough. Our camping gear still smelled of wood smoke. Our hiking boots were caked with forest mud, and the rusted Forest Service badge Marcus had pocketed served as a tangible reminder of our ordeal. For several days, we tried to resume our normal routines. Marcus returned to work. I caught up on household tasks, and we made efforts to process what had happened through conversation and rationalization. The distance from those terrifying nights in the forest made it easier to convince ourselves that we had overreacted, that fear and isolation had amplified natural phenomena into something supernatural. That illusion shattered on Thursday evening, when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. My fingers trembled as I opened it, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a photograph, grainy and shadowed but unmistakably real. It showed Marcus and me through the cabin window, taken on our first night there. We were sitting by the fire, unaware that we were being observed and documented. Below the image was a single line of text that made my hands shake uncontrollably. "Nice to finally see you up close." I showed the message to Marcus, watching his face pale as he stared at the screen. We had escaped the forest, but whatever had been hunting us there wasn't finished with its game. The distance we had put between ourselves and that cursed place meant nothing to something that could reach across space and time, to remind us that we were still being watched. That night, we installed additional locks on our apartment door and closed all the blinds, but I knew those precautions were meaningless against something that had already demonstrated its ability to follow us anywhere. As I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness, patient and tireless eyes were still watching, still waiting for the right moment to complete whatever purpose had driven them to reveal themselves to us in the first place. The text message was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, we would receive more photos, images of us at work, at the grocery store, walking through downtown Eugene. Each one was accompanied by brief messages that grew increasingly personal and threatening. We contacted the police, but there was little they could do. The messages came from untraceable numbers. The photos were taken from public spaces where surveillance was technically legal, and our story about the abandoned cabin sounded too fantastic to take seriously. The investigation into the illegal rental operation led nowhere. The website had been taken down, the email addresses deactivated, and the payment processing company claimed no record of our transaction. It was as if the entire setup had been created specifically to lure us to that isolated location, then vanished without a trace once its purpose was served. Marcus and I began making plans to move away from Eugene, perhaps to another state entirely. But deep down, I suspected that distance wouldn't solve our problem. Whatever had marked us during those nights in the forest would follow us wherever we went. A patient and implacable presence that would never stop watching, never stop waiting for the perfect moment to complete the hunt it had begun in those dark woods beneath Mount Hood. The forest had claimed us, even though we had escaped it physically. We belonged to it now, and to the thing that guarded its secrets with such terrible dedication. All we could do was wait and wonder when it would decide to finish what it had started in that condemned cabin where a murdered ranger still stood his eternal watch. I pulled onto that back road with just enough moonlight to silhouette the thick tree line against the sky. The night air drifted in through my window, left open from when I'd been smoking earlier, and I remember glancing in the rear view for no real reason, a sense tugging at my gut that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The road stretched out in front of me, empty, silent, and unsettlingly dark. No streetlights, no farmhouses lit up in the distance, just a narrow route cracking beneath my tires. I tried to shake off my nerves by fiddling with the radio, but every station offered nothing but static. My hands clenched the wheel tighter than usual. It felt like the trees were watching me, as if waiting to see if I'd keep going or turn around. Still, I pressed forward, telling myself everything was fine. When I spotted a lone stop sign at a ragged four-way intersection, I exhaled in relief. It was a small hint of civilization. I slowed down, not quite stopping, thinking, all right, just make a left and you'll be halfway to your friend's place. That was when the tree line erupted with motion. Some creature burst into view, barreling straight toward my door. I nearly slammed the brake before instinct made me gun the gas instead. My headlights caught a flash of something with elongated limbs and teeth that glistened in a way teeth shouldn't. The sheer ferocity in its eyes, or whatever they were, made my stomach twist. It was so close I could sense its aggression, like it had been waiting for me to roll by with that open window. I pressed the accelerator until the engine roared, my heart thudding in my ears. The beast kept pace for a few unnerving seconds, snarling in an almost human rage. My window was wide open, an invitation if I screwed up for even a second. The tires squealed in protest, and I wrestled with the steering wheel to keep from flying off the road. Gravel pinged against the undercarriage. The creature lunged again, missing the window by inches. A guttural noise rang out behind me, and I couldn't tell if it was an animal's growl or something else. Then it fell back, swallowed by the dark. My pulse continued to pound as I tore away from that intersection, desperate to outrun whatever had just tried to reach me. Only once the road curved and the creature vanished from the mirrors did I allow myself a shaky breath. My mind raced with impossible questions. Had I run into a rabid animal? Or did something with genuine malevolence just choose me as its target tonight? Staring into the night, I kept my foot on the gas, determined to leave that lonely crossroads and the thing that lurked there, far behind. The trees seemed to close in on both sides of the road, branches reaching toward my car like grasping fingers. Every shadow held potential danger, and I found myself jerking the wheel at any hint of movement. The radio's static had shifted to a low rhythmic hum that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. I reached to turn it off completely, not wanting anything to mask the sounds outside the car. As I navigated the winding road, I noticed something strange in my peripheral vision. The moonlight that had previously illuminated my path seemed to dim, as if clouds had suddenly gathered overhead. But when I glanced up, the sky remained clear, stars twinkling innocently against the blackness. The darkness surrounding me felt unnatural, almost tangible, like it was pressing against the windows of my car. I checked my phone. No service. Of course, these back roads were notorious for dead zones. I was completely alone out here with whatever had just tried to attack me. The only sounds were my ragged breathing and the engine's steady hum. I pushed the car faster, praying that I would soon see the familiar landmarks that would lead me to my friend's house. I pulled into my friend's driveway, still gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in the world. Every muscle in my arms felt tight, and my pulse throbbed in my temple. The moment I killed the engine, I noticed how shallow my breathing had become. My fingers shook with leftover adrenaline as I fumbled with the door handle. I could almost sense that thing from the road hovering right behind me, ready to lunge again if I let my guard down. Inside, the house was warm and filled with laughter, so painfully normal that my brain needed a second to adjust. The conversation dropped the instant I walked in. I must have looked a complete mess. Wide eyes, hair plastered to my forehead. I tried to find my voice, but it came out raw and broken. Once the shock wore off enough for words, I rattled off a rambling account of something huge with teeth. Something that seemed more like a nightmare than any animal I'd come across before. Their faces reflected confusion. A couple friends asked if I was messing with them or if I'd had too much to smoke. Their dismissive reactions hit like a punch to the gut. I kept insisting it was real, too real, but it felt impossible to convey the intensity. My mind kept replaying how close that thing had gotten, how it showed this unnatural hostility. The more I tried to talk about it, the more I realized nobody could truly understand without having been there. I forced myself to sit down, but my nerves were thrumming too fiercely to stay still. Even when I tried to breathe and calm down, my gaze flicked toward the windows, half expecting those eyes to appear behind the glass. The walls felt stifling, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to be hidden away in my room or surrounded by people. Either way, I couldn't banish the image of snapping jaws and the grating, guttural sound still echoing in my head. "Hey, you need some water or something?" asked Michael, my oldest friend, looking genuinely concerned despite his skepticism. I nodded mechanically, grateful for the distraction. "Maybe it was just a coyote," offered Samantha, sprawled on the couch with her feet propped up on the coffee table. "They've been getting pretty bold lately, coming closer to residential areas." I shook my head. This wasn't a coyote. It was too big, too wrong. The word hung in the air, inadequate but somehow the most accurate description I could muster. "Wrong how?" pressed Michael, handing me a glass of water. Its proportions were off, and the way it moved. I trailed off, taking a long drink. The cold water helped ground me, but my hand still trembled slightly. It was like it knew exactly what it was doing, like it was hunting me specifically. Samantha and Michael exchanged glances, the kind that communicated volumes without words. They thought I was exaggerating, maybe even making it up entirely. I couldn't blame them. It sounded absurd even to my own ears. "Look, whatever it was, you're safe now," Michael said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Just crash here tonight and tomorrow we'll check out your car, make sure everything's okay." I nodded again, though I knew checking the car wouldn't solve anything. The thing that had lunged at me wasn't something that could be explained away by mechanical issues or exhaustion. It had been real, visceral, and terrifyingly intent. As the night wore on, my friends tried to distract me with drinks, games, and conversation about anything other than my encounter on the back road. I went through the motions, laughing when appropriate, responding when addressed, but my mind remained fixated on what had happened. Every unexpected noise made me flinch, and I found myself positioned with my back to the wall, eyes constantly darting to the windows and doors. Night dragged on, and everyone else drifted off to bed. Sleep was the last thing on my mind. There was a heavy weight in my chest, like dread that just wouldn't dissipate. I flipped through my phone, searching for anything. Urban legends, weird sightings, local warnings. My heart hammered as I stumbled onto stories about shapeshifters and cryptic creatures said to stalk lonely roads. Some details were scarily similar. Eerie canine forms, the sense of an intelligence behind the brutality. It made me question if I'd pushed my luck on a path I had no business traveling alone. The later it got, the more my thoughts spun in circles. I wondered if it had tracked me, if it knew exactly where I ended up. Logic told me that was absurd, but a gnawing suspicion kept me glancing at every window. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to shut my eyes, though sleep brought no comfort. I dreamed of glinting teeth and felt in the pit of my stomach that the next time might not end so cleanly. By morning, I was a jittery wreck, fueled by the same obsessive questions. Had I really escaped something no one else believed existed? Should I let it go or try to learn more? Fear and curiosity clashed in my thoughts, and I dreaded the idea that I might need to see that place again, just to prove it wasn't my imagination. Even so, the mere notion of returning to that cursed intersection twisted my insides with anxious anticipation. Something told me my story and the creatures wasn't finished. The morning light streaming through the blinds should have brought comfort, but instead, it only illuminated my exhausted face in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles underlined my bloodshot eyes, and a day's worth of stubble roughened my jaw. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the lingering dread that clung to me like a film. In the kitchen, Michael was already up, brewing coffee and scrolling through his phone. He glanced up when I entered, his expression shifting from casual to concerned. "Man, you look like hell," he remarked, sliding a mug of coffee toward me. "Rough night?" I grunted in response, grateful for the caffeine. "Didn't sleep much. Still thinking about that thing you saw?" I nodded, not wanting to elaborate. The dismissal from last night still stung, and I had no desire to be ridiculed again. "Look," Michael began, setting his phone down. "I've been doing some reading. There have been reports of unusual animal activity in that area. Nothing like what you described, but strange nonetheless." My attention snapped fully to him. "What kind of reports?" "Livestock getting attacked but not eaten. Hunters finding game that's been killed but left untouched. It's weird." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Why didn't you say anything last night?" Michael shrugged. "I thought you were just stressed or saw a normal animal and your mind filled in the blanks. But after seeing how shaken up you still are..." He trailed off, then added, "There's something else. The locals avoid that section of road at night. Have for years, apparently." "Why?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't comfort me. "They say it's not safe. Most write it off as superstition, but some are dead serious about it." I stared into my coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. "I need to go back there." "What? Why would you?" "Because I need to know if what I saw was real," I interrupted. "If I don't, I'll never be able to move past this." Michael looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Maybe I had. At least don't go alone," he said finally. "I'll come with you." Relief washed over me. Having someone else there would make it more bearable. But as grateful as I was for his offer, a part of me wondered if I was leading my friend into danger. The creature had seemed so focused, so deliberate in its attack. What if it was waiting for me to return? After breakfast, I sat at Michael's computer, diving into research while he made phone calls. The local newspaper archives yielded scattered reports that sent crawling sensations up my spine. 5 years ago, a driver reported their car being attacked by what they described as a large unidentifiable animal on the same stretch of road. The incident was dismissed as a bear encounter, despite the driver's insistence that it moved unlike any bear they'd ever seen. 3 years before that, a teenage couple claimed something had followed their car for several miles, occasionally rushing the vehicle before disappearing into the woods. They described it as walking on 2 legs, then 4, then 2 again. The report was buried in the local section, treated as nothing more than teenage hysteria. "Hey, check this out," Michael called from across the room. He was talking to someone on his phone while scrolling through a local message board. "This guy Joe I know from work says his grandfather used to be the sheriff here. According to him, there's been strange stuff happening around that intersection for decades." I moved over to look at his screen. The message board was filled with secondhand accounts, blurry photos that could be anything, and the usual mix of skepticism and belief. He says his grandfather investigated multiple reports but could never find concrete evidence. Eventually, they just put up warning signs about wildlife in the area and left it at that. "Are the signs still there?" I asked, not recalling seeing any on my drive. "Apparently, they kept disappearing. They stopped replacing them about 15 years ago." A chill crept up my neck. Does he have any theories about what it could be? Michael hesitated. "He says his grandfather believed it was a person." "A person?" I echoed, incredulous. "What I saw wasn't human." "Not a normal person," Michael clarified, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. "His grandfather thought someone was living out there in the woods. Someone who'd gone feral. He found evidence of a makeshift shelter once, but when they returned with a full search party, it was gone. No traces left. The idea of a human being capable of moving the way that creature had seemed impossible, and yet, wasn't that more plausible than some unknown animal species lurking undetected all these years?" "There's something else," Michael continued, scrolling further down the thread. "About 30 years ago, a psychiatric facility about 20 miles from here had a patient escape. Dangerous guy, violent tendencies. They never found him." "You think he could have survived in the woods all this time?" I asked skeptically. "People have done it before." "And if he was already unstable?" Michael shrugged. "Just a theory." I turned back to the computer, opening a map of the area. The intersection where I'd encountered the creature was at the center of a large tract of undeveloped woodland, miles from the nearest town. Perfect isolation for someone or something that wanted to remain hidden. "What about trail cameras?" I suggested. "Hunters use them all the time. There must be footage from those woods." Michael nodded and started searching. What we found was puzzling. The area was popular with hunters, but there was a noticeable absence of trail camera footage from the vicinity of that intersection. It was as if people instinctively avoided placing cameras there, or perhaps the cameras that were placed mysteriously malfunctioned or disappeared. As the day progressed, our research painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The intersection and the surrounding woods had a long history of unexplained incidents, dating back to when the road was first cut through the forest. Construction workers reported tools going missing, equipment breaking down without cause, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. I saved every relevant article, photo and forum post we could find, compiling them into a folder. If we were going back there, we needed to be prepared with as much information as possible. But with each new piece of evidence, my determination to return wavered. Whatever was out there had been hunting those woods for decades, possibly longer. And now it knew my face, my car, my scent. "We're not going unprepared," Michael insisted as afternoon faded into evening. Samantha had joined our research efforts after waking up. Initially skeptical, but gradually becoming invested as we showed her what we'd found. "I know a guy who works at the sporting goods store," she said, pulling out her phone. "He might be able to help us out with some gear." Within an hour, we had a small arsenal spread across Michael's living room floor. High-powered flashlights, a handheld spotlight that could illuminate objects hundreds of yards away, bear spray, a hunting knife, and a baseball bat. It looked like we were preparing for war rather than an investigation. "Don't you think this is overkill?" I asked, eyeing the weapons uneasily. "After what you described?" "No, I don't," Michael replied firmly. "Better to have it and not need it." Samantha was checking the batteries in the flashlights. "So what's the actual plan here? We just drive to the intersection and..." Wait, it was a good question. I hadn't thought that far ahead, driven more by the need to confirm what I'd seen than by any coherent strategy. "We should set up cameras," I suggested. "Film the whole thing from multiple angles. If something happens, we'll have proof." "And if nothing happens?" Samantha asked. Then I can finally convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. What I'd seen had been too vivid, too intense to be a figment of my imagination. "We should go in 2 cars," Michael added. "That way, if something happens to one vehicle, we have a backup." The planning continued as darkness fell outside. We decided to head out around midnight, late enough for the woods to be at their most quiet, but not so late that exhaustion would impair our judgment. We mapped out our route, identified potential escape paths if things went south, and even established a simple code to alert each other if something was wrong without alarming whatever might be listening. As the hour approached, a tense silence fell over us. The bravado and excitement of planning gave way to the sobering reality of what we were about to do. We were deliberately seeking out something that had already shown violent intent. Was this courage or foolishness? "We should tell someone where we're going," Samantha said suddenly. "Just in case." Michael nodded and sent a message to his roommate, who was staying with his girlfriend for the weekend. He kept it vague, just that we were checking out some local urban legend and would be back by morning. I doubted anyone would take it seriously if we didn't return, but it was better than nothing. I went to my car to retrieve something from the glove compartment, a small voice recorder I sometimes used for work. If we couldn't trust cameras to capture what we might encounter, perhaps audio would be more reliable. As I leaned into the vehicle, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. 3 long scratches running down the driver's side door, barely visible in the dim light of the driveway. I ran my fingers over them. They weren't deep enough to have compromised the metal, but they were unmistakably fresh, and they hadn't been there when I arrived last night. Something had found my car. Something had marked it. I looked around the quiet neighborhood, suddenly feeling exposed despite the ordinary suburban setting. Should I tell the others? They were already on edge, and this might be enough to call off the expedition entirely. But if something had tracked me here, weren't we safer confronting it on our terms rather than waiting for it to make the first move? I took a deep breath and returned to the house, the voice recorder clutched tightly in my hand. I decided to keep the scratches to myself, at least for now. We had come too far to turn back. "Ready?" Michael asked as I walked in. I nodded, the weight of the discovery heavy on my shoulders. "Let's do this." The drive back to that cursed intersection felt like descending into another reality. We took 2 cars, Michael and I in his Jeep, Samantha following in her sedan. The night was oddly still, the air heavy with moisture that promised rain but never delivered. Our headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead while deepening the shadows on either side. "Take the next right," I instructed, consulting the map on my phone. My voice sounded strained even to my own ears. Michael turned onto the back road I had traveled the night before. Unlike my solo journey, we crawled along at a cautious pace, both of us scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The CB radio we had borrowed crackled with Samantha's voice from the car behind us. "Everything looks normal so far. Are we getting close?" Michael picked up the handset. "About 2 miles to go, according to the map." I gripped the dashboard as we rounded a bend, my entire body tensing at the memory of what had happened here. The woods seemed even darker tonight, the trees more densely packed together. Was it my imagination, or were there fewer stars visible through the canopy than there should have been? "The stop sign should be just ahead," I said, my mouth dry. Michael slowed the Jeep further, the headlights now barely cutting 20 feet into the darkness. "I don't see anything yet." I leaned forward, straining my eyes. The intersection had been clearly visible last night, the stop sign reflecting my headlights from a distance. But now there was nothing but more road stretching into blackness. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered. "We should have reached it by now." Michael checked his GPS. "According to this, we're right on top of it." The CB crackled again. "Guys, why are we stopping?" Michael responded, "We're trying to find the intersection. It should be right here." "I'm looking at it right now," Samantha replied, confusion evident in her voice. "It's about 50 yards behind you." We both turned to look through the rear window. Samantha's headlights illuminated a section of road that we had just passed, and there, plain as day, stood a stop sign at a 4-way intersection. That's impossible, I whispered. We didn't pass any intersection. Michael reversed the Jeep slowly until we were alongside Samantha's car. She rolled down her window, her expression puzzled. What's going on? You guys drove right through it without stopping. We didn't see it, Michael explained, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. It wasn't there. Samantha looked from him to me, then back to the clearly visible intersection. Are you serious? It's right there. The implication sent a wave of nausea through me. Either we had both experienced the same hallucination, unlikely, or the intersection itself was somehow immutable, present for some observers but not for others. The thought was so unsettling that I almost suggested we leave immediately. But we had come for answers, and I wasn't leaving without them. Let's park at the intersection and set up the cameras, I said, forcing conviction into my voice. We positioned our vehicles at adjacent corners of the crossroads, creating a perimeter of light with our headlights. Samantha and I set up tripods with cameras, while Michael established a base station in the Jeep, connecting a laptop to monitor all feeds simultaneously. The night air felt electric against my skin as I secured the last camera. Every sound from the surrounding woods, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, sent prickles of awareness up my spine. I kept expecting to see those gleaming eyes emerge from the darkness at any moment. Everything's online, Michael called from the Jeep. We've got full coverage of all 4 approaches to the intersection. I rejoined him, checking the laptop screen. 4 separate feeds showed the empty roads extending from the crossroads. Samantha climbed into the back seat, her face pale in the blue glow of the computer. Now what? She asked. Now we wait, I replied, settling into the passenger seat with the spotlight resting across my lap. Minutes stretched into an hour with no sign of anything unusual. The only movement on the camera feeds was the occasional moth fluttering past a lens. Conversation dwindled to whispers, then to silence. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Maybe it was a one-time thing, Samantha suggested eventually, her voice startling in the quiet. I shook my head. The research showed a pattern. Whatever's out there, it's been here for years. But why hasn't it shown itself tonight? Michael wondered. We're sitting ducks out here. A disturbing thought occurred to me. What if it's watching us right now? Learning, adapting. Michael gave me a sideways glance. That implies a level of intelligence beyond what an animal should have. Exactly, I said softly. The laptop screen flickered, drawing our attention. One of the camera feeds, the one pointing down the eastern approach to the intersection, showed brief static before stabilizing. Did you see that? I asked, leaning closer to the screen. Probably just interference, Michael reasoned, but he sounded unsure. The feed flickered again, longer this time. When it cleared, something had changed. The road that had been empty moments before now contained a dark shape about 50 yards from the intersection. It was indistinct, low to the ground, and completely motionless. There, I hissed, pointing at the screen. What is that? Michael zoomed in on the feed, but the image became pixelated, the shape blurring into the darkness around it. Samantha, that's your camera, right? I asked, turning to the back seat. She nodded, eyes wide. Should we shine the spotlight in that direction? Not yet, Michael cautioned. If it doesn't know we've spotted it, we might be able to observe its behavior. We watched in tense silence as the shape remained still for several minutes. Then, so gradually that I thought I was imagining it at first, it began to move, not forward toward the intersection, but sideways into the trees bordering the road. Yet it never disappeared from view, as if the camera was tracking its movement automatically. That's not possible, Samantha whispered. The camera is fixed on a tripod. It can't be following anything. The shape continued its lateral movement until it had crossed completely out of what should have been the camera's field of view. Yet we could still see it now positioned among the trees watching the road. It's manipulating what we're seeing, I realized with growing horror. It's showing us what it wants us to see. As if in response to my words, the shape suddenly grew larger on the screen, not moving closer, but simply expanding in size. It no longer resembled anything recognizable, just a dark mass that seemed to absorb the light around it. And then, without warning, the feed cut to black. "We need to get that camera back," Michael said, reaching for the door handle. I grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? That thing is out there. Exactly why we need visual confirmation. The camera might have captured something before it went offline." Before I could argue further, a sharp crack echoed through the night, the unmistakable sound of breaking plastic and metal. "It's destroying the evidence," Samantha realized. That decided it. I snatched up the spotlight and threw open the passenger door. "Stay in the Jeep," I ordered Michael. "Keep the engine running. Samantha, watch the other feeds and tell us if you see anything." Michael started to protest, but I was already moving toward the eastern road, spotlight beam cutting a path through the darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs, but determination drove me forward. I needed to see it, needed to confirm that the creature that had haunted my thoughts was real. The spotlight illuminated the empty road ahead, the beam extending far beyond where the camera had been set up. I slowed my pace, scanning methodically from side to side. The trees loomed on either side, their shadows dancing as my light passed over them. There, a glint of metal in the underbrush about 40 yards ahead. I approached cautiously, the beam fixed on the spot. As I drew closer, I could make out the shattered remains of the camera. The tripod bent at an unnatural angle as if it had been struck with tremendous force. I crouched to examine it, keeping the spotlight trained on the surrounding area. The camera was beyond repair, its lens cracked and internal components exposed, but the memory card might still be intact. I pried open the damaged casing with trembling fingers. A twig snapped somewhere to my left. I froze, slowly turning the spotlight in that direction. The beam caught nothing but trees and undergrowth. Another snap, this time to my right. I swung the light around, pulse racing. "Michael," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I'm surrounded." No response came from the direction of the intersection. I stood backing away from the broken camera, the memory card clutched in my fist. The night had gone eerily silent. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I began retreating toward the Jeep, moving backward to keep my eyes on the tree line. The spotlight beam shook with the trembling of my hands, creating shifting shadows that seemed to dance and move of their own accord. 20 yards from the intersection, I heard it, a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It resonated in my chest, primal and threatening. I quickened my pace, nearly tripping over an exposed root. "Michael!" I shouted, no longer caring about alerting the creature. It knew exactly where I was. The intersection came into view, the Jeep's headlights a beacon of safety. But something was wrong. The vehicle's doors stood open and there was no sign of Michael or Samantha. "Michael!" I called again, panic rising in my throat. "Samantha!" Only the growl answered me, closer now, circling. I spun in place, the spotlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. And then I saw it. A pair of eyes reflecting the light hovering at the edge of the tree line. Not animal eyes with their simple reflective quality, but something more complex, more aware. They blinked once, slowly, deliberately. I backed toward the Jeep, never taking the spotlight off those eyes. They remained fixed on me, unmoving, as if gauging my next move. When my back hit the vehicle's hood, I fumbled behind me with one hand, searching for the door handle. The laptop still sat on the dashboard, the remaining camera feeds active. A quick glance showed 3 empty roads and one feed that displayed Michael and Samantha, standing at the north end of the intersection, looking confused and calling out. They appeared to be searching for something, searching for me, but that was impossible. I was at the intersection and they were nowhere in sight. Unless, the realization hit me like a physical blow. The creature wasn't just manipulating what we saw on camera, it was manipulating what we saw, period. Somehow it had separated us while making us believe we were still together. A scraping sound drew my attention back to the tree line. The eyes had vanished. In their place stood a figure that made my breath catch in my throat. It was roughly humanoid but wrong in ways that defied description. Proportions slightly off, movements too fluid and yet too jerky at the same time. It stood partially concealed by the shadows, but I could make out elongated limbs and what appeared to be matted fur or hair covering its body. It tilted its head, studying me with an intelligence that was unmistakable. Then it opened its mouth, revealing teeth that gleamed wetly in the spotlight's beam. And it spoke. "Why did you come back?" The voice was rough, disused, but undeniably human. Male, middle-aged, with an accent I couldn't place. The disconnect between the creature's appearance and the normalcy of its speech was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all. I couldn't answer, my voice trapped somewhere between my lungs and lips. The creature took a step forward, emerging further from the shadows. I could see now that what I had taken for fur was actually tattered clothing, layered and filthy from years of wear. The elongated limbs were the result of some kind of crude extensions, sticks or bones lashed to arms and legs with strips of leather, creating a disturbing silhouette. "You shouldn't have come back," it continued, taking another step. "No one comes back. My paralysis broke. Where are my friends?" I demanded, the spotlight beam steady now despite my fear. The creature tilted its head again, a gesture almost bird-like in its abruptness. "Friends?" it repeated as if testing the word. "No friends here. Just you and me." "I saw them on the camera," I insisted. "What did you do to them?" A sound emerged from the creature that might have been a laugh, a dry, rasping chuckle that raised the hair on my neck. "Cameras lie, eyes lie. Everything lies in these woods." It was close enough now that I could smell it, an odor of unwashed body, wet earth, and something metallic that might have been blood. I backed around the jeep, putting the vehicle between us. "What are you?" I asked, the question escaping before I could consider whether I wanted to know the answer. The creature paused, seeming to consider the question. "I was like you once, a long time ago." It gestured vaguely at the surrounding forest. "Then I found this place. Or it found me." "The psychiatric facility," I whispered, recalling Michael's research. "You escaped." Another of those terrible laughs. "Is that what they told you? That I was the crazy one?" It shook its head, the movement unnaturally fluid. "I was a doctor there. I came to study the reports about this intersection. The patients who spoke of something waiting in the woods." My mind reeled at the revelation. This thing had once been a psychiatrist? A rational, educated person who had somehow devolved into this? "What happened to you?" I asked, unable to keep the horror from my voice. "I learned the truth," it replied simply, "about the thin places in the world, where reality bends." It made a twisting motion with its hands. "I've been studying it ever since, learning its rules, becoming part of it." "And the attacks?" I pressed. "The people you've hurt?" The creature's expression shifted, something like shame flickering across its distorted features. "The hunger comes. Not always. But when it does." It trailed off, then fixed me with those unsettlingly intelligent eyes. "You should leave now, while I'm still myself." As if to emphasize its point, a tremor ran through its body, and for a moment its form seemed to blur at the edges, becoming less solid, less defined. I seized the opportunity, lunging for the driver's door of the Jeep. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine idling quietly. "They won't find their way out without you," the creature called as I slammed the door shut. "Your friends. They're lost in the fold." I hesitated, hand on the gear shift. "What does that mean?" "Where are they?" The creature approached the Jeep, placing one distorted hand on the hood. "I can show you, but once you see, you can never unsee, never leave." It smiled, revealing those two sharp teeth again, like me. In that moment, I made my decision. I threw the Jeep into reverse, backing away from the creature in the intersection. Its expression didn't change as I retreated. If anything, it looked resigned, almost relieved. "I'll find help," I called through the window. "I'm coming back for them." The creature stood motionless in the receding headlights. Just before it disappeared from view, I thought I saw it shake its head slowly, a gesture of futility or perhaps pity. I drove in a daze, mind racing to process what had happened. The creature's words echoed in my thoughts. Thin places. Reality bends. Lost in the fold. It sounded like the ravings of a madman, and yet, I had seen impossible things tonight. The intersection that appeared and disappeared. The camera that showed what shouldn't have been visible. My friends present on the feed but absent in reality. As I reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The dark shape of the creature stood in the middle of the road behind me, watching. Then it turned and walked back toward the intersection, its movements becoming increasingly inhuman with each step, until it seemed to fold in on itself and vanish into the night. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, bursting through the doors with a wild look that must have alarmed the deputy on night duty. I babbled about my missing friends, the creature at the intersection, the impossible things I had witnessed. The deputy looked skeptical but took my statement, promising to send officers to investigate. They found nothing, of course. No sign of Michael or Samantha. No cameras at the intersection, not even tire tracks to suggest our vehicles had been there. The deputy who had taken my statement pulled me aside after they returned empty-handed. "Look," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "This isn't the first time we've had reports about that intersection, but officially we don't talk about it." I stared at him, hope flaring that someone might finally believe me. "What do you know about it?" "Not much," he admitted. "Just that people go missing there sometimes. Not often enough to establish a pattern, but..." He hesitated. "My grandfather was sheriff here back in the 80s. He had a file on that place that he kept separate from the official records. Said some things you just don't put in reports if you want to keep your job." "I need to see that file," I insisted. The deputy shook his head. "It's gone. Disappeared after he died. But he told me stories." He leaned closer. "He said that intersection isn't always there. That it moves. And that whatever lives there has been taking people for generations." A chill ran through me. Did he ever mention someone from the psychiatric facility? A doctor who went missing? The deputy's eyes widened slightly. "How did you know about that?" Before I could answer, the sheriff himself emerged from his office, ending our conversation with a pointed look at the deputy. I was asked to return the next day to provide additional details for the missing persons report. As I left, the deputy slipped me a piece of paper with an address scrawled on it. "My grandfather's old hunting cabin," he whispered. "He kept copies of everything important there. If that file still exists, that's where it would be." I spent the night in a motel, unable to return to Michael's house with its empty rooms and painful reminders. Sleep eluded me entirely, my mind replaying the encounter with the creature over and over. By morning, I had convinced myself that the only way to save my friends was to understand what we were dealing with. The deputy's grandfather's cabin was deep in the woods, but thankfully nowhere near the infamous intersection. It was a small, weathered structure that looked like it hadn't been visited in years. The door was secured with a padlock, but the key was hidden exactly where the deputy had said it would be, under a false rock beside the front step. Inside, the cabin was dusty but surprisingly organized. Filing cabinets lined one wall, each drawer meticulously labeled. It took me nearly an hour to find what I was looking for. A thick folder labeled simply Crossroads. The contents were a treasure trove of information that both validated my experience and deepened the mystery. Reports dating back to the early 1900s described encounters similar to mine. A creature that could manipulate perception, an intersection that wasn't always where it should be, people who disappeared without a trace. But the most valuable document was a journal belonging to Dr. Andrew Walsh, the psychiatrist who had vanished from the nearby facility over 30 years ago. The entries chronicled his investigation into the intersection, his growing obsession with what he called a tear in the fabric of reality. The final pages were disturbing, documenting Walsh's deteriorating mental state as he spent more and more time at the intersection. He wrote of hearing voices, of seeing the world fold and unfold like origami, of feeling his own identity becoming fluid, malleable. The last entry, dated just before his disappearance, contained a crude map and the cryptic message, "I understand now. It's not a place but a process, and I am becoming part of it." The map showed the intersection, but with additional lines radiating outward that didn't correspond to any physical roads. Notes in the margins referred to parallel paths and points of convergence. At the center of the intersection, Walsh had drawn a spiral with a single word beside it, Gateway. I spent hours studying the documents, piecing together a theory that seemed simultaneously absurd and the only possible explanation for what I had witnessed. The intersection existed at a point where reality was thin, where multiple versions or dimensions overlapped. The creature, once Dr. Walsh, had somehow learned to manipulate these overlaps, trapping people between them. And my friends were caught there now, possibly existing in a different version of the intersection than the one I had escaped from. Armed with Walsh's notes and map, I returned to my motel to prepare. If I was going to rescue Michael and Samantha, I needed to understand the rules of this place better than the creature did. Walsh's journal suggested that the intersection's properties were strongest during what he called liminal times, dawn, dusk, and the hour of midnight. It was during these windows that the boundaries between realities were at their thinnest, and when the creature was most powerful. But it also implied a weakness. The creature, having become part of the process, was bound to the intersection and its immediate surroundings. It could influence perception from a distance, but could not physically leave the area where the realities overlapped. The next morning, I purchased supplies, more powerful flashlights, a compass, chalk to mark my path, and a digital recorder to document my experiences. The memory card from the destroyed camera had yielded nothing but static, but I wasn't taking chances this time. As I prepared to return to the intersection at dusk, the time Walsh's notes suggested would be optimal for finding the gateway, I received an unexpected phone call. It was the deputy. "Don't go back there," he said without preamble, his voice tight with urgency. "I have to," I replied. "Michael and Samantha are still missing." "Listen to me," he insisted. "We found something. An old recording from one of my grandfather's interviews with a survivor. Someone who encountered that thing and made it back." "What did they say?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't deter me. "That it lets one person escape deliberately, as bait. It wants you to come back, to bring more people with you. That's how it feeds, not just on bodies, but on the connections between people. The emotional bonds." He paused. "It's a trap." I considered his words, weighing them against what I had learned from Walsh's journal. "I know," I said finally, "but I'm going anyway. I think I understand how it works now. How to beat it at its own game." The deputy was silent for a long moment. "Then God help you," he said at last, "because no one else can where you're going." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, I drove once more toward the intersection that had claimed my friends. The creature's words echoed in my mind. "Why did you come back?" It had seemed surprised by my return, almost concerned. Not the reaction of something that had deliberately let me escape as bait. No, there was more to this story than either the deputy or Walsh's journal had revealed. And as I approached the now familiar turn onto that back road, I felt a strange sense of inevitability. Whatever waited at the intersection, whether monster or man or something in between, I was finally ready to face it, to understand it, and perhaps, if I was both clever and lucky, to overcome it and rescue my friends from whatever fold in reality had swallowed them. The road stretched before me, darkness gathering at its edges as dusk settled over the forest. I took a deep breath, gripped the steering wheel, and pressed forward into the gathering shadows. Certain of only one thing: whatever happened next would forever change my understanding of reality itself. And somewhere ahead, at that impossible intersection where paths both seen and unseen converged, the creature that had once been Dr. Andrew Walsh was waiting. My name is Charles Williams, and I am 74 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on August 18, 1996, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to make sense of what occurred during those fateful days in the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Even now, as I put pen to paper, I can feel my heart racing and my palms growing clammy. But I feel compelled to share this story, if only to warn others who might venture into those woods unprepared for what lurks in the shadows. I had just retired from a long stint as a high school math teacher. 35 years of equations, proofs, and teenage drama had left me yearning for something different, something wild. I'd always dreamed of exploring the vast forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and with my newfound freedom, I decided it was time to make that dream a reality. My trusty RV, A 1985 Winnebago Chieftain that I'd lovingly restored over the years seemed like the perfect vehicle for this adventure. I spent weeks preparing for the trip, stocking up on supplies, poring over maps, and making sure every system in the old girl was in working order. As the departure date drew near, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. There was something about the idea of being alone in the wilderness that both thrilled and unnerved me. It was during one of my final preparation sessions that I received an unexpected call. The gruff, familiar voice on the other end belonged to Carl Emerson, my old college roommate and longtime friend. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe even a year, but Carl had a way of picking up right where we left off. "Chuck, you old dog," he bellowed through the phone. "Word on the street is you're planning a little excursion up north. Room for one more?" I hesitated for a moment. Carl and I had been close once, but time and distance had taken their toll. He'd always been a bit of a wild card, prone to impulsive decisions and reckless behavior. But there was also a part of me that missed his energy, his zest for life. And if I was being honest with myself, the idea of facing the wilderness alone was becoming increasingly daunting. "Sure, Carl," I found myself saying. "Why not? It'll be like old times." Carl's booming laugh filled the line. "Hot damn. I'll be there tomorrow. We're gonna paint that peninsula red, my friend." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the right decision. Carl's presence would certainly make the trip more lively, but would it also invite chaos? Only time would tell. True to his word, Carl showed up on my doorstep the next morning, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and his old Gibson guitar case in the other hand. His salt and pepper hair was longer than I remembered, tied back in a loose ponytail, and his face was weathered by years of outdoor living. But his eyes still held that mischievous glint I remembered from our college days. "Ready to raise some hell, Chuck?" He grinned, pulling me into a bear hug. I couldn't help but smile. "It's Charles now, Carl. And let's try to keep the hell-raising to a minimum, shall we? We're not as young as we used to be." Carl just laughed and clapped me on the back. "Speak for yourself, old man. I'm in the prime of my life." We spent the rest of the day loading up the RV and going over our route. Carl regaled me with stories of his recent adventures. Apparently, he'd spent the last few years bouncing between odd jobs and music gigs, never staying in one place for too long. As night fell, we cracked open a couple of beers and sat on my back porch, watching the stars come out. "You know, Chuck," Carl said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I'm glad you're letting me tag along. Truth is, I've been feeling a bit lost lately. Figured maybe this trip might help me find my bearings again." I nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of needing to find oneself. "Well, there's plenty of space up there to do some soul-searching. Just don't get too lost in those woods, all right?" We clinked our bottles together, neither of us aware of how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The next morning, we hit the road bright and early. The Winnebago rumbled to life, and we pulled out of my driveway with a sense of anticipation. The journey north was filled with easy conversation and occasional bursts of off-key singing, as Carl insisted on playing DJ with his eclectic mix of classic rock and obscure folk songs. As we crossed the Mackinac Bridge into the Upper Peninsula, I felt a shift in the air. The landscape became wilder, more untamed. Dense forests stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional glimmer of a lake or the rugged outline of distant hills. Carl, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, stirred and looked out the window. "Man, would you look at that," he breathed, his eyes wide. "It's like stepping back in time." I nodded, feeling a sense of awe myself. "That it is. Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" We drove on, deeper into the heart of the peninsula. Our destination was a small, secluded campsite near Taquamenon Falls that I'd read about in an obscure travel guide. It was off the beaten path, promising solitude and unspoiled natural beauty. As we turned off the main road onto a narrow, winding trail, the trees seemed to close in around us. The RV's headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating a world of deep shadows and rustling leaves. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, its cry echoing through the forest. "You sure you know where we're going, Chuck?" Carl asked, peering out into the darkness. "Pretty sure," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The guide said it was about 10 miles down this road. We drove on in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional creak of the RV's frame. Just as I was beginning to wonder if we'd missed a turn, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing nestled against the banks of a gently flowing river. "This must be it," I said, relief evident in my voice. We parked the RV and stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the nearby Taquamenon Falls filled the air, a constant soothing rumble. Stars blanketed the sky more than I'd ever seen before, their light casting a faint silvery glow over the clearing. "Now this," Carl said, spreading his arms wide, "is what I call getting away from it all." We spent the next hour setting up camp, arranging our outdoor furniture and getting a fire going. As we sat around the crackling flames eating a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was what I'd been looking for, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. Carl strummed idly on his guitar, picking out a melancholy tune. "You know," he said between chords, "I've got a good feeling about this trip, Chuck. I think we might just find what we're looking for out here." I nodded, gazing into the fire. "I hope you're right, Carl, I really do." As we turned in for the night, settling into our respective bunks in the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings and the overactive imagination of a city dweller in the wilderness. But as I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard something moving in the underbrush just beyond the clearing's edge. Little did I know, our peaceful retreat was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The next few days passed in a blissful blur of hiking, fishing, and relaxation. We explored the area around our campsite, marveling at the raw beauty of Taquamenon Falls and the surrounding forest. Carl and I fell into an easy rhythm, reminiscing about old times and sharing our hopes for the future. On our fourth night in the woods, we decided to stay up late, drinking beer and singing around the campfire. Carl had brought his old guitar and we took turns belting out classic rock songs, our off-key voices echoing through the trees. As the fire died down to embers, Carl set aside his guitar and leaned in close. "Hey, Chuck," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You ever hear any weird stories about these woods?" I raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Carl shrugged, taking a swig of his beer. "Oh, you know, ghost stories, local legends, that kind of thing. I was talking to this old guy at the general store when we stopped for supplies yesterday. He was going on about some creature that's supposed to roam these parts. Called it the Vatrax, I think." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Come on, Carl, don't tell me you believe in that kind of nonsense." "Nah, not really," he replied, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But you gotta admit, it adds a little spice to the camping experience, doesn't it? Imagining some mysterious beast lurking in the shadows?" I was about to respond when a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our campfire. We both jumped, then laughed nervously. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Come on, it's late. We should turn in." We doused the fire and headed into the RV. As I lay in my bunk, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive and full of secrets. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to a strange sound. It was just past midnight, according to the glowing digits of the RV's clock. The sound came again, a sort of scratching noise like something dragging across the metal exterior of the vehicle. "Carl," I whispered, sitting up. "You hear that?" Carl was already awake, his eyes wide in the dim light. "Yeah," he whispered back. "What the hell is it?" The scratching continued, moving slowly around the RV. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. "Stay here," I told Carl. "I'll check it out." "Are you crazy?" Carl hissed, but I was already moving towards the door. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. I swept the beam around the campsite, half expecting to see some monstrous form looming in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the stars twinkling overhead. I was about to head back inside when something caught my eye. Near the back of the RV, the ground looked disturbed, as if something had been digging. I moved closer, shining the flashlight on the spot. The earth was indeed turned up with long, deep furrows carved into the soil, but there were no footprints, no sign of what had caused the damage. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Carl's story about the vate tracks. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just an animal, I told myself. A bear, maybe, or a particularly ambitious raccoon. I hurried back into the RV where Carl was waiting anxiously. "Well?" he demanded as soon as I was inside. "What was it?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Probably just an animal," I replied finally. "But there's some weird marks on the ground out there, like something was digging." Carl's face paled. "You don't think—" "No," I said firmly. "Whatever you're thinking, just no, it was an animal. Carl, nothing more." We stayed up for a while longer, talking in low voices, trying to convince ourselves that there was a rational explanation for what had happened. But even as exhaustion finally overtook us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just experienced our first brush with something beyond our understanding. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself hoping that the morning light would wash away the fears of the night. But deep down, I knew that our peaceful retreat had taken a dark turn, and that the true terror was yet to come. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the horrors of the night seeming like a distant dream in the cheerful light of day. Carl and I avoided talking about what had happened, instead focusing on planning our activities for the day. I was thinking we could hike out a bit further today, I suggested over a breakfast of instant oatmeal. There's supposed to be some interesting rock formations about 5 miles north of here. Carl nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sounds good," he said, his usual enthusiasm somewhat muted. "Maybe a change of scenery is just what we need." We packed day packs with water, snacks, and basic survival gear, then set out on the trail leading away from our campsite. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, the air fresh and invigorating. As we walked, I could feel some of the unease from the previous night beginning to dissipate. The hike was challenging but rewarding. We climbed steep inclines, scrambled over fallen logs, and forded shallow streams. By midday, we had left the familiar territory around our campsite far behind, venturing into parts of the forest that felt wilder, more untamed. It was Carl who spotted it first, a structure barely visible through the trees, its weathered wood almost indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. "Hey, Chuck," he called out, pointing. "You see that?" I squinted in the direction he was indicating. "Is that a cabin?" We approached cautiously. As we drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary cabin. The structure was old, far older than it had any right to be in these remote woods. The roof had partially caved in, and vines and moss covered much of the exterior. It looked as if it hadn't been touched by human hands in decades, maybe even a century. "What do you think?" Carl asked, a mix of excitement and apprehension in his voice. "Should we check it out?" I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to turn back, to return to the safety of our campsite. But curiosity won out. "All right," I said. "But let's be careful. That roof doesn't look too stable." We approached the cabin slowly, alert for any sign of danger. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and it creaked ominously as Carl pushed it open. The interior was a mess of broken furniture, rusted tools, and years of accumulated forest debris. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting eerie shadows across the floor. But it was the walls that caught my attention. Every available surface was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They didn't resemble any language or writing system I'd ever seen. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist as I looked at them, creating unsettling patterns that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. "My God," Carl whispered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. "What is all this?" I shook my head, unable to tear my gaze away from the bizarre markings. "I don't know. Some kind of code, maybe? Or—" I trailed off, not wanting to voice the other possibility that had entered my mind. Carl seemed to read my thoughts. "Or some kind of ritual site," he finished, his voice hushed. We spent the next hour exploring the cabin, taking photos and trying to make sense of what we were seeing. But the more we looked, the less sense it all made. There were no personal belongings, no signs of who might have lived here or when. just the endless, maddening symbols covering every wall. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The air in the cabin felt thick, oppressive, as if we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Carl," I said finally, "I think we should head back. It'll be dark soon, and I don't want to be trying to find our way in the night." Carl nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, you're right. This place is starting to give me the creeps anyway." As we stepped out of the cabin, I couldn't help but take one last look at those bizarre symbols. For a moment, I could have sworn they were moving, rearranging themselves on the walls. I blinked hard, chalking it up to eye strain in the dim light. The journey back to our campsite was tense and quiet. Both Carl and I were lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming that morning, now felt oppressive and watchful. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. It was nearly sunset by the time we made it back to the RV. The familiar sight of our campsite should have been comforting, but instead, it felt exposed and vulnerable in the fading light. "Let's get a fire going," I suggested, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "I don't know about you, but I could use a hot meal and a cold beer." Carl nodded, but his usual enthusiasm was noticeably absent. As we went about our camp routines, I could see him constantly scanning the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the gathering darkness. We sat around the campfire that evening, the flickering flames casting long shadows across our faces. The beer and food had done little to ease the tension that had settled over us since our discovery of the cabin. "Chuck," Carl said suddenly, breaking the long silence, "what do you think those symbols meant?" I sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. "I don't know, Carl. Could be anything. Maybe some old trapper's code or what?" Carl pressed. I hesitated, not wanting to give voice to the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind. Or maybe something older, something not entirely natural. Carl nodded slowly, his face grave in the firelight. "You're thinking about that V-Trek story, aren't you?" Before I could respond, a sound cut through the night. The same scratching noise we'd heard the previous evening, but louder now, more insistent. Carl and I exchanged alarmed glances. "That's it," Carl said, standing up abruptly. "I'm getting tired of this. Whatever it is, I'm going to scare it off." He grabbed a burning stick from the fire, brandishing it like a torch. I quickly got to my feet, snatching up the flashlight and a heavy branch that we'd been planning to use for firewood. "Be careful," I warned. But Carl was already marching towards the sound, his makeshift torch held high. We circled the RV, the firelight casting eerie, dancing shadows around us. That's when we saw it, a figure at the edge of our campsite, hunched over and scratching at the ground with long claw-like fingers. "Hey!" Carl shouted, waving the burning stick. "Get out of here!" The figure didn't react to Carl's shout. It just kept scratching, digging at the earth with a single-minded intensity that sent chills down my spine. Carl took a step closer, and that's when the thing turned towards us. In the flickering light of the torch, I saw its face, or rather the absence of a face. Where there should have been eyes, there were only empty black sockets. Its mouth was a gaping, toothless maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Carl froze, the color draining from his face. "Warren," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" I couldn't speak. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, it couldn't be real. And yet there it was, slowly rising to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. "Run," I finally managed to croak out. "Back to the RV, now!" We turned and ran, panic giving us speed. I could hear it behind us, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. We reached the RV and practically dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The scratching started again almost immediately, more frantic now. The whole RV shook with the force of it. "Do you have anything we can use to defend ourselves?" Carl asked, his eyes wild with fear. I rummaged through my supplies, my hands shaking. "I've got a hunting knife and a flare gun," I said, pulling them out. "But I don't know if that'll be enough." We stayed up all night, huddled in the RV, listening to the relentless scratching. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and in those moments of silence, the suspense was almost worse than the noise. We'd strain our ears, wondering if it had gone, only for the scratching to start up again louder than before. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the scratching finally stopped. Carl and I looked at each other, exhausted and terrified. "Is it gone?" Carl whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we can't stay in here forever." Slowly, cautiously, we opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and damp, mist rising from the ground in ethereal tendrils. At first glance, everything looked normal. But then we saw the ground around the RV. The earth was torn up, covered in deep, jagged marks that no animal could have made. And there, a few feet from the RV, was a hole, a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter descending into darkness. Carl and I approached it warily. The hole was deep, far deeper than it should have been possible to dig in a single night, and at the bottom, barely visible in the dim light, was a glint of white. "Are those—" Carl began, his voice cracking. I nodded grimly. "Bones. Human bones." We looked at each other, the full horror of our situation finally sinking in. Without a word, we turned and began packing up camp as quickly as we could. Neither of us wanted to spend another moment in that haunted forest. As we drove away, the RV bouncing along the rough dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over. That somehow, in some way, the thing we'd encountered, the vet tracks, was still out there, waiting. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a small logging community called Newberry. Even then, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, we didn't feel safe. We went to the local police station to report what we'd seen, but the bored-looking deputy behind the desk didn't seem to take us seriously. "Probably just a bear," he said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "They can make a real mess of a campsite if they're after food." "It wasn't a bear," Carl insisted, his voice rising. "We saw it. It was something else." The deputy sighed, finally meeting our eyes. "Look, fellas, I get it. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night, but there's no monsters out there. Just animals and the occasional lost hiker. Now, do you want to file a report about vandalism to your campsite, or—" We left the station feeling frustrated and invalidated. Carl was fuming, muttering under his breath about small-town cops and willful ignorance. I was quieter, lost in my own thoughts. Part of me wanted to believe the deputy, to accept the rational explanation that we'd simply been spooked by an animal, but I knew what I'd seen. Those empty eye sockets, that gaping maw. No bear could have looked like that. We got a room at a small motel on the outskirts of town. Neither of us felt up to driving any further, and if I was honest with myself, I was afraid of what might happen if we tried to leave the area. It felt like we were caught in the gravity of something larger than ourselves, something we didn't understand. That night, as we lay in our separate beds, unable to sleep, Carl spoke up. "Chuck," he said, his voice small in the darkness. "What do we do now?" I sighed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. "I don't know, Carl, I really don't know." The next few days passed in a blur. We stayed in Newberry, telling ourselves we were researching, trying to find out more about the vate tracks and the strange symbols we'd seen in the cabin. But the truth was, we were both too scared to leave. We scoured the local library, pored over old newspapers, and even tried to talk to some of the older residents of the town. But we found nothing concrete, just vague stories and half-remembered legends. The vate tracks, it seemed, was a shadow on the edge of local folklore, never fully seen or understood. It was on our 4th day in Newberry that Carl announced he was leaving. "I can't do this anymore." "Chuck," he said, shoving clothes into his duffel bag, "I feel like I'm going crazy. I need to get out of here, get back to the real world." Part of me wanted to go with him to put this whole nightmare behind us, but something held me back. A need to understand, to make sense of what had happened to us. "I think I'm going to stay a bit longer," I told him. "Just a few more days. There's got to be some explanation for what we saw." Carl paused in his packing, looking at me with a mix of concern and fear. "Don't get lost out there, Chuck," he said softly. "Whatever that thing is, it's not worth your sanity. Or your life." We said our goodbyes the next morning. As I watched Carl's car disappear down the road, I felt a profound sense of loneliness settle over me. But I was determined to see this through, to find some answers. Over the next week, I delved deeper into my research. I expanded my search, looking into Native American legends, early settler accounts, even geological surveys of the area. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The Vetrax, or something like it, had been part of local lore for centuries. The Ojibwe people had stories of a creature that lived beneath the earth, emerging at night to hunt. Early French trappers wrote of a demon des bois, a demon of the woods, that left strange markings on trees and rocks. But it was a geological report from the 1950s that really caught my attention. The survey team had discovered a network of caves running deep beneath the Upper Peninsula. Most of the system was too narrow for human exploration, but they'd found evidence of something living down there. Claw marks on the cave walls, inexplicable bone fragments, and in one particularly chilling note, a reference to symbols of unknown origin carved into the rock. As I pieced together this information, a theory began to form in my mind. The Vetrax wasn't just some forest creature or local boogeyman. It was something older, something that had been in these woods long before humans arrived. And those symbols we'd seen in the cabin, they were a language, a way of marking territory or casting spells. The cabin itself was probably built by some long-ago trapper or settler who'd had his own encounter with the creature and tried to protect himself with its own symbols, but knowing this didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the threat feel more real, more immediate. Because if the Vetrax was real, if it had been haunting these woods for centuries, then what chance did we stand against it? I stayed in Newberry for another week, gathering as much information as I could. But eventually, I knew I had to leave. The motel was getting expensive, and I could sense the locals were starting to view me with suspicion. The strange outsider asking too many questions about old legends. As I packed up my car, I made a decision that I knew was probably foolish, but I couldn't help myself. I was going back to our campsite, just for a day, I told myself, just to see if there was any evidence left, anything to confirm that what we'd experienced was real. The drive back into the forest was tense. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. But I pressed on, following the now familiar road to our old campsite. When I arrived, I was shocked to find the area completely undisturbed. There were no signs of our campfire, no marks on the ground where the RV had been parked. Even the hole we'd seen that last morning was gone, the earth smooth and covered in a layer of fallen leaves. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had all been a dream, a shared hallucination brought on by too many campfire stories and Carl's wild imagination. But as I walked around the clearing, something caught my eye. There, carved into the trunk of a massive old oak tree, were the symbols. The same bizarre twisting shapes we'd seen in the cabin. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still light against the dark bark. My heart pounding, I approached the tree. The symbols seemed to shift and move as I looked at them, forming patterns that hurt my eyes and made my head spin. And as I stood there staring at this impossible message, I heard it. The scratching sound coming from somewhere behind me. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear it pursuing me. That dry, scraping sound growing louder. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and somehow managed to start the engine. As I sped away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall, twisted shape at the edge of the clearing, its empty eye sockets fixed on my retreating car. Then I was around a bend in the road and it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was out of Michigan entirely. I crossed into Wisconsin, then kept going, putting as much distance between myself and the Upper Peninsula as I could. In the years since, I've tried to put that experience behind me. I moved to Florida, about as far from the forests of Michigan as I could get. I've never told anyone the full story, not even my family. Who would believe me? Carl and I kept in touch for a while, exchanging the occasional phone call or letter, but our conversations were always stilted, haunted by the unspoken memory of what we'd experienced. Eventually, we drifted apart. Last I heard, he'd moved to California, taken up surfing. I hope he found some peace out there by the ocean. As for me, I've never been camping again. I can't even bring myself to walk in the woods behind my house, because I know now that there are things out there in the wild places of the world, things that defy explanation or understanding. Sometimes late at night, I'll wake up to a sound. A faint scratching like claws on metal. In those moments, my heart races and I'm back in that RV, huddled in the dark, listening to the V-tracks trying to get in. It's just the wind in the palm trees, I tell myself. Just a branch scraping against the side of the house. But deep down, I know the truth. The V-tracks is still out there, in the dark forests of Michigan, waiting, watching. And someday, somehow, I fear it might find me again. So if you ever find yourself in the Upper Peninsula, if you're ever tempted to venture off the beaten path and into those ancient woods, remember my story, and really listen to the sounds of the forest at night. Because if you hear scratching, if you see strange symbols carved into the trees, run, and don't look back, because the V-tracks is real. And once it finds you, it never truly lets you go. I never thought I'd be the one to tell this story. Hell, I never thought I'd live to tell it. But here I am, Ethan Blackwood, former city dweller and adventure seeker, now a shell of the man I once was. It's been 3 years since that fateful trip to Shadow Lake, and not a day goes by that I don't relive the horrors I experienced in those godforsaken woods. It all started innocently enough. I was burnt out from my high-stress job as a software engineer in Boston. My relationship had just ended messily, and I was desperate for an escape. That's when I remembered the old RV my uncle had left me, a clunky 1985 Winnebago that had seen better days. On a whim, I decided to take a month-long sabbatical and drive up to the remote wilderness of northern Maine. I'd always been drawn to solitude, having grown up in rural Vermont where our nearest neighbor was miles away. Little did I know that this solitude would become my worst nightmare. I set out on a crisp September morning, the air tinged with the first hints of autumn. The drive was long but therapeutic, watching the bustling cities give way to rolling countryside and finally to the dense, primeval forests of Maine. By the time I reached the outskirts of Shadow Lake, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping behind the towering pines, casting long shadows across the narrow, winding road. Shadow Lake wasn't on any tourist maps. I'd heard about it from a colleague who swore it was the most peaceful place he'd ever visited. If you want to get away from it all, that's where you go, he'd said. Now, as I navigated the RV down the overgrown dirt road leading to the lake, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, the trees unnaturally still in the fading light. I finally reached a small clearing by the lakeshore and parked the RV. The lake stretched out before me, a vast mirror reflecting the darkening sky. The water was so still it looked like black glass. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. This was what I needed: peace, quiet, and solitude. That first night passed uneventfully. I set up a small campfire, grilled some hot dogs, and sat watching the stars come out one by one. The night was silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. I felt the tension of the past few months start to melt away. The next morning I woke early, eager to explore my surroundings. I made a quick breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, then set out with my backpack and camera. The forest around Shadow Lake was old, the kind of ancient woodland that makes you feel small and insignificant. Massive pines towered overhead, their branches blocking out much of the sky. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles and moss, punctuated by granite boulders left behind by long-ago glaciers. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest was too quiet. There were no bird calls, no chattering squirrels, none of the usual sounds you'd expect in the woods. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my city-trained ears not used to real silence. It was around midday when I stumbled upon the first sign that something was truly wrong. In a small clearing, I found a campsite, or what was left of one. A tent lay in shreds, its contents strewn about as if a bear had rummaged through it. But there were no claw marks, no signs of animal activity. It looked more like someone had taken a knife and methodically sliced the tent to ribbons. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out. Is anyone here? No response. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were drag marks in the dirt, leading away from the tent and into the dense underbrush. And those marks, they looked disturbingly like someone had been pulled away against their will. I should have left right then. Should have run back to my RV and driven away as fast as I could. But curiosity, that damned human trait that's both our greatest strength and our fatal flaw, got the better of me. I decided to follow the drag marks just for a little while, to see if I could figure out what had happened. The trail led me deeper into the forest, to areas where the trees grew so close together that I had to squeeze between them. The light grew dimmer, filtered through layers of leaves and needles. And then I heard it, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a whisper so faint at first that I thought I was imagining it. But as I pressed on, it grew louder. Not one whisper, but many, overlapping and intertwining. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I couldn't make out words, just a sibilant hissing that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Panic started to set in. I turned to go back the way I'd come, but in my fear and confusion, I'd lost track of the path. Every direction looked the same, just endless trees and shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be all around me now, pressing in like a physical force. I started to run, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face. I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from those terrible whispers. But no matter how fast I ran, they seemed to keep pace, always just behind me, always just out of sight. As I ran, the forest seemed to change. The trees looked wrong. Their bark was darker, almost black, and seemed to pulse with an inner light. The branches reached out like grasping fingers, trying to snag my clothes and hair. And the ground began to feel soft and yielding, like I was running across a gigantic sponge. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that nightmarish forest. Finally, my foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the breath knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping for air, the whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more distinct. Join us, they seemed to say. Become one with the forest. Give yourself to the shadows. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around wildly. And that's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the shadows between the trees. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways I can't fully describe. Too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. And their faces, where there should have been faces, there were only swirling patterns of darkness. One of the creatures stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. It reached out a long, spindly arm towards me, fingers elongating like tendrils of smoke. I felt a scream building in my throat, but before I could release it, everything went black. I woke up back in my RV, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. Sunlight was streaming through the windows, and for a moment, I thought it had all been a terrible nightmare. But then I noticed the scratches on my arms, the tears in my clothes, and the pine needles in my hair. It had been real, all of it. I started the RV with shaking hands and peeled out of that clearing like the hounds of hell were after me. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those shadowy figures emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the road and the endless forest. It's been 3 years since that day, and I've never gone back to Shadow Lake. I've tried to convince myself that what I experienced was some kind of hallucination, maybe brought on by stress or some toxic plant I accidentally ingested, but deep down I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something ancient and malevolent, something that whispers in the shadows and preys on the unwary. And sometimes late at night when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear those whispers calling me back to Shadow Lake. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Stay away from Shadow Lake. Don't let curiosity get the better of you like it did me, because if you go there, if you hear those whispers, you might not be as lucky as I was. You might never come back at all. For months after my escape from Shadow Lake, I tried to convince myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. I threw myself back into my work, took up meditation, even saw a therapist. But the nightmares persisted. Every night I found myself back in those dark woods, pursued by whispers and shadowy figures. It wasn't just the nightmares. Strange things began happening in my waking life, too. I'd catch glimpses of impossibly tall, thin figures out of the corner of my eye, only to have them vanish when I turned to look. The shadows in my apartment seemed deeper, more alive somehow. And always, there was the faint sound of whispering just at the edge of hearing. I knew I was losing my grip on reality. I had to know the truth, had to prove to myself one way or another that what I'd experienced was real. So against every instinct screaming at me to run and never look back, I decided to return to Shadow Lake. This time, I went prepared. I bought a high-end GPS device, a satellite phone, and enough supplies to last a week. I also brought a handgun. Not that I thought it would do much good against whatever was out there, but it made me feel a little safer. As I drove back up to Maine, a sense of dread settled over me like a heavy blanket. The closer I got to Shadow Lake, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The sky seemed to darken, the air grew thick and heavy, and that eerie silence I remembered from before descended once again. I arrived at the lake just before sunset. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. The glassy surface of the water, the dense forest pressing in on all sides. I parked the RV in the same spot as before and set about securing the perimeter with motion sensor cameras and floodlights. That first night, nothing happened. I sat up until dawn, jumping at every creak and rustle, but the woods remained still and silent. As the sun rose, I began to wonder if I had imagined it all after all. Emboldened by the uneventful night, I decided to venture into the forest. I wanted to find that torn-up campsite, to prove to myself that it had been real. I set out, GPS in hand, carefully marking my trail. Hours passed as I hiked deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to grow taller, their trunks wider and more gnarled. The canopy overhead became so thick that it was like twilight on the forest floor, even though my watch told me it was midday. And then I found it, the clearing with the shredded tent. It was exactly as I remembered, down to the drag marks leading into the underbrush. My heart pounded as I realized that it hadn't been a hallucination. It was all real. That's when I heard the whispers. They started soft, just like before, a susurration that could have been the wind in the leaves. But they grew louder, more insistent. I turned to run, but the forest had changed around me. The trees were closer together, their bark black and pulsing with that eerie inner light. I checked my GPS, trying to retrace my steps, but the screen was a jumble of nonsensical symbols. In my panic, I dropped it, the device disappearing into the spongy forest floor. The whispers were all around me now, no longer indistinct but terrifyingly clear. "You came back," they said. "We knew you would. No one escapes Shadow Lake forever." I ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. But no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find my way out. The forest had become a labyrinth, and I was hopelessly lost. Night fell, plunging the woods into an impenetrable darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me blind and terrified. I could hear movement all around me, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, and always those horrible whispers. In desperation, I fired my gun into the air, hoping the sound might scare away whatever was out there. The gunshot echoed through the trees, and for a moment everything went silent. Then, slowly, a pale, phosphorescent glow began to emanate from the trees themselves. In that ghostly light I saw them, the shadow creatures. They emerged from behind trees, oozed up from the ground, coalesced from the very air itself, dozens of them surrounding me on all sides. Their bodies were as I remembered, impossibly tall and thin, with too many joints bending in unnatural ways. But now I could see their faces, or rather the lack thereof. Where features should have been, there were only swirling vortexes of absolute darkness. One of the creatures stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like the rustling of dead leaves. "We are the Whispers," it said. "We are the forgotten ones, the left behind, the lost. And now, Ethan Blackwood, you will join us." It reached out with arms that stretched and elongated like smoke, enveloping me in a cold, dark embrace. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt myself being pulled apart, my very essence unraveling like a thread being plucked from a tapestry. In that moment of dissolution, I understood. Shadow Lake was a trap, a feeding ground for these ancient, hungry entities. They lured in lost souls, fed on their fear and confusion, and ultimately absorbed them into their collective consciousness. I saw flashes of other victims, the owners of that shredded tent, hikers who had wandered off the trail, campers who had stayed one night too long, all of them now part of the Whispers, their memories and experiences added to the hive mind. As I felt the last vestiges of my individuality slipping away, a thought occurred to me, a memory of something I'd read about black holes. At their event horizon, information can neither be fully absorbed nor escape. I clung to that thought, to my sense of self, refusing to be completely assimilated. I don't know how long I existed in that state of half-absorption. It could have been days or years. Time had no meaning in that place between places. But somehow, impossibly, I came back to myself. I awoke once again in my RV, my clothes torn and dirty, my body covered in scratches and bruises. The sun was rising over Shadow Lake, its rays sparkling on the water's surface as if nothing had happened. I didn't wait around to question my miraculous escape. I started the RV and drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was hundreds of miles away. It's been 5 years since that second encounter with the Whispers of Shadow Lake. I've tried to move on, to forget, but I know now that's impossible. Because I didn't escape, not really. A part of me is still there, trapped in that dark forest, and a part of them came back with me. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see a swirling darkness behind my eyes. Sometimes I hear the whispers in my head calling me back. And sometimes, just sometimes, I feel an overwhelming urge to share this story, to lure others to Shadow Lake. Because that's how they spread. That's how they feed. And now, I'm one of them. So let this be a final warning. If you ever find yourself near a place called Shadow Lake, turn back. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Don't listen to the whispers, because once you do, you'll never truly leave. And neither will they.